In this video, we are going to talk all about fishing a jig for bass. Now, I did something a little bit different in this video. I actually asked AI, artificial intelligence, what the top 10 questions were that fishermen had about fishing a jig. And it spit out a bunch of questions and they were actually fairly legit. So I want to go through these 10 questions that are probably the most asked questions when it comes to jig fishing and try to answer them in this video, including one that I think is one of the most important, which is why you may not be catching fish on a jig right now. So before we get into those questions, this video is brought to you by Fin Fishing Apparel. Right now is the month of May, and for the month of May, there is a package deal happening over at Fin Fishing. You can actually get a USA made sun shirt like the one you see me wearing right here, and a duck hat like the one that you see me wearing right here. It's a package deal. You can get it for $75. So all you got to do, add the sun shirt to cart, add the duck hat to cart, and it will automatically discount at checkout. Shopping at Fin Fishing is truly one of the best ways to help support this channel. I greatly appreciate all of you who have done so. All right, let's get on to these questions. If you see me looking down, it's because I have a list of the questions down below. Now, the first question is, what is a jig? You know, if you're fairly new to bass fishing, I want to briefly touch on this. A lot of guys you may hear talk about jig fishing, and honestly, in the sense of jig fishing in general, a jig means something a little bit different when you're walleye fishing versus when you're bass fishing versus when you are ocean fishing. But most of the time when guys talk about catching fish on a jig, and when it comes to bass fishing, they're talking about this guy right here. A jig, also known as a jig and pig, is what a lot of guys call it, or a jig and plastic trailer, is basically a tungsten or lead head, well, it's a jig head with a skirt on it like this. This is usually a silicone skirt, a living rubber skirt. This is a fairly weedless bait that comes to cover extremely well, and a lot of guys are going to attach some sort of plastic trailer on the back. Here's a chunk trailer. There's a lot of different trailers, but we'll get into that a little bit later in the list that we're going to talk about. But this is a jig. This is a great bait, one of the best baits ever made for bass fishing. All right, let's talk about the next question. What types of jigs are best? That is another question that you guys may understand if you've been around bass fishing for a little while. But if you're newer to bass fishing, or maybe even an intermediate angler, or you haven't picked up a jig, there are a lot of different types of jigs out there on the market. And the biggest differences in all those jigs is simply the shape of the jig head itself. You have what we call football jigs, you have what we call swim jigs, you have what we call flipping jigs. There's a lot of different jigs and jig styles out there on the market. Now, each of these jigs are really meant for certain types of cover and or structure. For example, if I am fishing a little bit deeper and I'm fishing more rock, that is really where I like a football jig. If I'm trying to put a jig into a heavy laydown, a lot of times I'm going to pick up a flipping jig. Now, with all that being said, when it comes to different jig head styles, I think that the number one jig for bass fishing is what you call an arky head. An arky head or a sparky head is kind of a good all-around jig. You can do a little bit of everything with it. It skips really well. You can put it in cover. You can swim it. You can fish it really, really deep. So an arky head jig is the one that I would recommend when it comes to bass fishing. All right, question number 3. What is the best time to fish a jig? Now, this is kind of an interesting question because it's a very loaded question. But I will say that one of the best times that I like to fish a jig is in colder water. It seems like to me, I have some of the best luck with jigs fishing them in cold water. Now, am I saying that they won't work in warm water or in hot water during the summer? Absolutely not. They absolutely have a place in hot water, but I tend to have a little bit more of a consistent bite with a jig in cold water. Now, one of the things that I fish in the summertime mostly is a swim jig. I do like to fish a swim jig a lot if the cover allows me to do it. And basically a swim jig is, you know, I'm gonna fish it pretty high in the water column through a lot of cover. The other thing I like to do in the summertime in hot water is actually really stroke a jig. Pop that thing way off the bottom. That tends to help me catch a lot of fish in warm water months. But in general, when that water temperature is between about 45 and I'd say about 60, 62 degrees, that kind of water zone I really like for fishing a jig. All right, my computer just turned off on me, so let me put my my password in real quick. All right, let's get on to the very next question. What trailer should I use for a jig? And when I say trailer, I talked about it a little bit earlier. A trailer is just this soft plastic that you are putting on the back of a jig. And look, you can put almost any type of soft plastic trailer on the back of a jig. You really can. You can put Swimbaits on the back of a jig. For example, here's a Kitech Swimbait. I like to thread this on the back of a jig at times. On this type of trailer right here is a chunk style trailer. This is probably my #1 trailer in cold water. This trailer here doesn't have a lot of action. It doesn't have a lot of flipping and flapping. It's a very subtle bait. And a lot of times subtle baits work really well in cold water. So I'm gonna pick up a chunk style trailer a lot in cold water and match it up with my jig just like this. Another really good trailer, and you guys have heard me talk about this bait, I talked about it even yesterday, is a Zoom Speed Crawl. I love a Zoom Speed Crawl. I use this bait for so many different aspects. Carolina rigs, what we talked about yesterday, on the back of a jig is what I talked about today. I've caught some giant bass flipping and punching this bait, a Zoom Speed Crawl, through heavy cover. I've also caught a lot of fish just flipping it on a really tiny Texas rig. So this is a bait. I always have a ton of Zoom Speed Crawls. They get a lot of bites. It's also a very good trailer. Now, the thing about a speed crawl and how it's different than a Zoom chunk is that it does have a flapping, kicking motion to it. So if I'm fishing in a little bit dirtier water, or sometimes during those summer months when I want a little bit more of an aggressive action, that's when I might lean on the speed crawl. But it doesn't have to just be a speed crawl. There's a number of crawls out there on the market. Those are just some of the favorites, the ones that I have used a lot in the past. I do not always think that the trailer is super important as far as actually getting bites. I think that there are days out there where you could have totally different trailers and get the same amount of bites. It's really just kind of the action of the jig and how you're presenting it, which is what is going to get you those bites. All right, let's move on to question number 5. How do you fish a jig effectively? Now, there's a number of different ways to fish a jig, but to me, there are 3 main ways that you fish it. Okay, the first way, probably the way that I fish it the most, is a simple, what I'm gonna call hop off the bottom. I am going to cast this thing either on the shoreline, out in the middle of a pond, up underneath of a dock, and I'm gonna lift my rod up where I think that bait's coming about a foot off the bottom, and then I'm gonna let it fall back down to the bottom. And then I'm gonna repeat that process. Lift it up. Sometimes I might even pop it real quick on the top of that lift so it shoots up, pop, goes back down. It's a simple hop retrieve. That is probably the #1 way that I fish it, just letting that bait go up and down. And a bass is usually gonna get that bait on the fall. When that bait is falling back down, that's when they get it. You pick back up again, and that fish is swimming off with it. And we'll talk a little bit more about the bite here in just a moment. But that's probably my #1 way of fishing it. The next way, this is a way that I tend to fish a jig a lot when I am fishing on really like hard bottom areas. If I'm fishing around a lot of rock cover, maybe shell beds, even sand at times, simply just dragging the bait across the water or across the bottom. I'm gonna cast the bait out. Instead of hopping it, I'm just dragging it across the bottom. Literally, I can feel that jig hit every single rock. I can feel it crawl over everything on the bottom. Maybe it's a stump, whatever it may be. Drag it across the bottom. It does not have to be complicated. Drag it across the bottom. A lot of times really lethargic bass in really cold water, bass that are highly pressured, really like you to just simply drag that thing across the bottom. The next way is simply swimming a jig. Swimming a jig is exactly what you would think. You cast the bait out and you swim it. And look, you can even, there's a number of different ways that you can swim a jig. I've also literally just caught bass casting the bait out and reeling it. Now, when I do swim a jig, I think that it's important every now and then to pop your rod every now and then or kill that bait. You know, kind of similar to ways that we might fish like a jackhammer, you know, a chatterbait or whatever it may be. When you're working that bait, it's not always just a steady retrieve. Sometimes I like to pop that bait, let it fall maybe a foot. Those little motions in your bait are really going to help entice bass to actually biting the bait. But to me, those are the three main ways we all fish a jig. We hop it, we drag it, we swim it. All right, let's talk about the next question. What rod and reel setup is best for jig fishing? This is definitely a question that gets asked all the time. And so to me, there is a range when it comes to this. I like to fish a jig on a rod between 7 foot and 7 foot 6 inches, usually a medium heavy power to heavy power, but typically always a fast action rod. That is what I really like. Fast action rod between 7 foot, 7'6", usually a medium heavy to heavy. Now, depending on the size of the jig, or if I'm fishing it in really tight cover versus casting it, is what is going to change that. If I'm casting a jig a long ways, making a hook set out a long ways, I like a 7 foot 6 inch rod. I like that longer rod to help me on the hook set, to help me get that bait out there further. If I am fishing a lot of heavy jigs, there's been times in my life where I like to flip like a 1 ounce jig into lily pads, into heavy cover. I still do that when I can get on that bite. In that situation, I'm gonna use a heavy power rod, but I would say that a medium heavy power rod is probably the rod that I tend to use the most when it comes to jig fishing. When it comes to line, that is another big thing, that there's really a big range when it comes to line. Because jigs come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. You know, the jig that I'm holding right here is a kind of a finesse jig. This is actually a 3/8 ounce jig. I use a lot of 1/4 ounce jigs. That's pretty light when it comes to jig fishing. A lot of times when I'm using finesse jigs, I like 15-pound fluorocarbon. That is what I'm gonna use a lot. If I'm flipping and pitching into heavy wood cover, a lot of times I like 20-pound fluorocarbon. And a lot of times I'm gonna be using a little bit bigger jig, a 1/2 ounce jig, a 5/8 ounce jig in that situation. There are also times where, like I said earlier, I might be fishing a 1 ounce jig in really heavy cover. I might use 50-pound braid. Okay, so there is a range when it comes to using a line that's gonna match your jigs. You really just kind of have to match that situation that you're fishing to the jig. And guys, if you have any questions down below, please feel free to ask, and I'll definitely try to get down there in the comments when it comes to jig fishing. But that is my rod reel line setup. Oh, I didn't talk about the reel. When it comes to a reel in jig fishing, almost 9 times out of 10, I'm using a fast pace reel. Anything that is at least in the 7 range and definitely in the 8 range. I typically use an 8.1 to 1 gear ratio reel. You could use like a 7.5, a 7.3, and absolutely be fine with that as well. But that is rod reel line setup for a jig. All right, let's talk next about question number 7. How do I know when a bass bites my jig? This is a question my brother used to ask to me all the time. Like, how do I know when a bite happens? The first thing that I will say is that most of the time a bass bite on a jig, I tell guys a lot of times, like, you'll know when it happens. You will know, because a lot of times when a bass hits a jig, you will feel a big thump on your rod. You lift that bait up, it falls, punk, you feel it like a lightning bolt go through your rod. Sometimes they don't hit it quite as hard, but it seems like a lot of times you pick up on that next hop and that fish is just moving off with the bait. You go to lift it and you can tell your line is moving away. And sometimes it's at a slow, medium slow pace. Sometimes it's at a relatively fast pace. But I say most of the time you will know when a jig is bite, when you have a jig bite. The one time that I think is harder for people to understand, this happens with a jig, it also happens a lot with a Texas rig, is that sometimes you're working that jig, and the more that you work a jig, the more that you will get a feel of just what it feels like as you're bringing it up and down through the water column. But a jig bite that you get a lot of times, you may not feel that thump. You go to pick up, and what it feels like is somebody cut your jig off with a pair of scissors. You go to pick up, and it's just like there's a bunch of slack in your line. And what typically happens, a bass bit that jig, and he is now swimming towards you. Whether you are fishing on the bank and he's swimming towards you, or you're fishing in the boat and he's swimming towards you, when you pick that up and he has swam, 2, 3, 4 foot towards you, you're not gonna feel a whole lot. And so if you feel like something changed, the best thing you can do is start to reel. Usually when you start to reel, you'll start to see your line tighten up, and you will start to realize, yeah, a fish is swimming towards me, and then you jack them. So those are kind of the main bites you're gonna get with a jig. All right, going on to question number 8. What color jigs are best for bass? You guys know that I'm not big into the color game. I actually talked about this recently in a video. When it comes to a jig, there's 3 colors that I use. One is this one right here, black and blue. Phenomenal color. I use it in clean water. I use it in muddy water. I tend to use it in a little bit more muddy and off-color water more than anything, but it is really good in clear water at times. Now, the first bait that I pick up a lot in clear water is one like this, the first color. This is a green pumpkin. We all know green pumpkin if you've been around bass fishing. It catches the snot out of fish all the time. It mimics bluegill, it mimics bait fish, it mimics crawdads. It is a great color, and I use it all the time. The next one is a white one. A simple white or shad colored jig is going to be the next one. Typically when I am fishing a white colored jig, it is a swim jig, and I am swimming it through the water column. There are very few times throughout the year where I am actually flipping and pitching a white jig, although when the fish are heavy on shad, which they may be for you guys during this time of the year around a shad spawn, flipping a white jig is actually a great way to catch fish that is definitely unique, and not a lot of guys are doing that. But those are probably the 3 main colors that I fish with. All right, let's go on to the next question, question number 9. Where should I fish a jig? This is one of those things where really there's no bad situation in my mind to fish a jig. There truly isn't a bad situation, because that is what makes a jig a jig. That's what makes it one of the best baits out there on the market, because you can fish it in a variety of cover. You can fish it in wood, you can fish it in rock, you can fish it in grass, you can fish it underneath docks, you can fish it on absolute bare bottom. You can fish a jig anywhere that you want. You really just kind of have to pick the right size jig to kind of match where you're going to be fishing it. But you can fish it anywhere and everywhere that you want. You can fish it in extremely deep water. I fished a jig in 30 foot, 35 foot, using a 3/4 ounce, 1 ounce football jig, dragging across the bottom. I've also used really light jigs, a 1/4 ounce jig, flipping and pitching really shallow cover in the past as well. So the good thing about a jig, there is no perfect place for a jig. There are at times though better baits to use. For example, I have done a lot of pond fishing in my life, and at times it's just better to go with a Texas rig in ponds, because sometimes in ponds you have a lot of that snot grass, that grass that gets caught on everything, and a jig will definitely collect that snot grass, definitely up here on the weed guard or around the hook. Sometimes in a pond it might just be better to fish a Texas rig over jig. Sometimes a Texas rig is a good, for example, in the summertime, I might get a lot more bites on a Texas rig than I do a jig. So there's no bad place to fish a jig, but sometimes there are better options for the bass, but there's no bad place to fish it. You can fish these things absolutely everywhere. Now, the last question, which I thought was a pretty important one, why am I not catching fish on a jig? If there is one thing that I've seen a lot across any jig fishing video that I've done, is that there are a lot of anglers who are just do not have confidence in a jig. And I can relate, because I have gone through times where I had a lot of confidence in jigs, and then I lose that confidence. And then I go and start catching fish on a jig again and have a tremendous amount of confidence again. The biggest thing that you can do with a jig and any bait that you are trying to learn is, if you want to learn how to catch more fish on it, lock the thing in your hand. Put everything else in the rod locker, keep everything else at home, and just pick up that jig and learn to fish a jig. Because it's so easy for us as anglers, if we don't get a bite in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours out there, we're digging for a drop shot, we're digging for a wacky rig, we're digging for a bait that we know can get us a lot of bites, instead of just locking this in your hand and really learning the jig. Once you learn it, once you get a few bites, I've always said it takes 2 bites really to get a lot of confidence in a bait. Sometimes it's just 1 bite. Sometimes you go out with a new bait, you're throwing it out there, you get 1 bite, you catch a good fish, and now you are settled down and you can fish that bait. But sometimes it takes a handful of bass to really get a feel of a lure. So just lock the thing in your hand. I can promise you, you are going to catch fish on a jig. Also, go with a finesse jig. You know, like if you can't get bit on a jig, go with something that's a little bit smaller. Maybe a 1/4 ounce finesse jig, a 3/8 ounce finesse jig. Those smaller jigs definitely get more bites than big jigs. All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know down below in the comments and I will do more videos just like this. I appreciate you guys watching. I will see you guys tomorrow, and don't forget to check out that fin fishing gear right here. My hook, my hand's hooked. All right, see you tomorrow.